Australia is not only home to the Great Australian Outback, the Great Barrier Reef, kangaroos and koala bears, but rolling vineyards and iconic wines, specifically Shiraz. Australia is one of the world's largest wine exporters. In fact, up to 60% of the wine that is produced here is exported. In this lesson, we are heading south, and not only will we visit the vines and wines of Australia, but we're going to hop on over to the land of rugby, sheep and the Shire and Sauvignon Blanc, New Zealand. A warm welcome from me and all of us here at Shaw Academy, where we aim to equip you with the knowledge and skills that will help you reach your goals and dreams today. Welcome back to your professional diploma in wine appreciation. We have reached the final stop of our world tour, and today in lesson 7, we're going to end on a high note by visiting Australia and New Zealand. My name is Julia Blaine, and it has been such a pleasure guiding you through the wonderful world of wine. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe the history of vines and wines in Australia, as well as list the important wine growing regions there. You should also be able to discuss the important wine regions in New Zealand, and lastly, describe the profiles of typical wines from Australia and New Zealand. Before we get into our lesson, let's quickly recap on last week's lesson challenge. Last week, I asked you to plan your own trip to my home country, South Africa. I asked you to choose 2 wine regions that you'd like to visit and describe to a friend what the climate is like in those regions and which grape varietals you can expect to taste there. From lesson 6, you had many regions to choose from. So there really isn't a right or a wrong answer because it's all based on your personal preference. Some examples of what you could have chosen for cool climate regions are Walker Bay or Constantia. Classic grape varietals from those regions and great wines to try that really reflect the terroir of these regions would be Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. For warmer climates, you could choose to visit Stellenbosch or the Swartland region, and here you'll find great examples of Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah or Shiraz. I'm curious to see which regions you chose to visit, so please remember to share with us on social media. It was the first European settlers that discovered that vines could not only grow but thrive in Australia when they settled there in the late 18th century. And by the end of the 19th century, Australia had a well-established wine industry. The first wines to come out of Australia were sweet, fortified wines, often labelled as port or sherry. In the 1970s, tables turned and sweet, fortified wines fell away and made way for table wines. Over the following 2 to 3 decades, the export market grew exponentially, which led to massive increases in vineyard plantings. Unfortunately, Australia has been heavily impacted by climate change, and since 2006, they've experienced extreme weather events, including crippling droughts, disastrous wildfires, and abnormally wet growing seasons. South Australia and Victoria were mostly affected by these weather events, whereas Western Australia was less affected and actually experienced optimal conditions for grape growing. Most of Australia is too hot or dry to successfully grow grapevines, and for that reason, majority of the wine regions are concentrated along the coastline. Grape growing and winemaking activities in Australia are scattered across the island. Most Australian wine producers will purchase grapes from grape growers across the country. Without refrigeration, there might not be a wine industry in Australia today. Australians can establish a vineyard anywhere that they want to. The availability of water is the only limiting factor. The array of climates and soil types around Australia result in wines that truly reflect the region's distinct terroir, making Australia an incredibly diverse wine-growing country. Australia is known for producing wines both in high quantity as well as quality. In 2018, Australia was ranked as the 6th largest wine producer globally, and in total, there are 65 official wine-producing regions or appellations. Common white grape varietals that you can find in Australia include Riesling, Chardonnay, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and Muscat. And on the red side, you can find Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Grenache Noir, and Shiraz. Shiraz and Chardonnay are the most planted grape varietals, and together they make up 44% of the total vineyard plantings. Did you know that the Australian Wine Research Institute, or AWRI, is one of the most prestigious and admired wine academies in the world? Today, Australian winemakers and vine growers are embracing change and are experimenting with new grape varietals, the most notable one being Pinot Grigio, which comprised 2.4% of the national harvest in 2010. Viognier is another grape varietal that has grown in popularity, along with Tempranillo, Sangiovese, Zinfandel, and Barbera. For new plant material to be approved in Australia Australia is not only home to the great Australian outback, the Great Barrier Reef, kangaroos and koala bears, but rolling vineyards and iconic wines, specifically Shiraz. Australia is one of the world's largest wine exporters. In fact, up to 60% of the wine that is produced here is exported. In this lesson, we are heading south, and not only will we visit the vines and wines of Australia, but we're going to hop on over to the land of rugby, sheep and the Shire, and Sauvignon Blanc, New Zealand. A warm welcome from me and all of us here at Shaw Academy, where we aim to equip you with the knowledge and skills that will help you reach your goals and dreams today. Welcome back to your professional diploma in wine appreciation. We have reached the final stop of our world tour, and today in Lesson 7, we're going to end on a high note by visiting Australia and New Zealand. My name is Julia Blaine, and it has been such a pleasure guiding you through the wonderful world of wine. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe the history of vines and wines in Australia, as well as list the important wine growing regions there. You should also be able to discuss the important wine regions in New Zealand, and lastly, describe the profiles of typical wines from Australia and New Zealand. Before we get into our lesson, let's quickly recap on last week's lesson challenge. Last week, I asked you to plan your own trip to my home country, South Africa. I asked you to choose 2 wine regions that you'd like to visit and describe to a friend what the climate is like in those regions and which grape varietals you can expect to taste there. From lesson 6, you had many regions to choose from. So there really isn't a right or a wrong answer because it's all based on your personal preference. Some examples of what you could have chosen for cool climate regions are Walker Bay or Constantia. Classic grape varietals from those regions and great wines to try that really reflect the terroir of these regions would be Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. For warmer climates, you could choose to visit Stellenbosch or the Swartland region, and here you'll find great examples of Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah or Shiraz. I'm curious to see which regions you chose to visit, so please remember to share with us on social media. It was the first European settlers that discovered that vines could not only grow but thrive in Australia when they settled there in the late 18th century. And by the end of the 19th century, Australia had a well-established wine industry. The first wines to come out of Australia were sweet, fortified wines, often labelled as port or sherry. In the 1970s, tables turned and sweet, fortified wines fell away and made way for table wines. Over the following 2 to 3 decades, the export market grew exponentially, which led to massive increases in vineyard plantings. Unfortunately, Australia has been heavily impacted by climate change, and since 2006, they've experienced extreme weather events, including crippling droughts, disastrous wildfires, and abnormally wet growing seasons. South Australia and Victoria were mostly affected by these weather events, whereas Western Australia was less affected and actually experienced optimal conditions for grape growing. Most of Australia is too hot or dry to successfully grow grapevines, and for that reason, majority of the wine regions are concentrated along the coastline. Grape growing and winemaking activities in Australia are scattered across the island. Most Australian wine producers will purchase grapes from grape growers across the country. Without refrigeration, there might not be a wine industry in Australia today. Australians can establish a vineyard anywhere that they want to. The availability of water is the only limiting factor. The array of climates and soil types around Australia result in wines that truly reflect the region's distinct terroir, making Australia an incredibly diverse wine-growing country. Australia is known for producing wines both in high quantity as well as quality. In 2018, Australia was ranked as the 6th largest wine producer globally, and in total, there are 65 official wine-producing regions or appellations. Common white grape varietals that you can find in Australia include Riesling, Chardonnay, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and Muscat. And on the red side, you can find Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Grenache Noir, and Shiraz. Shiraz and Chardonnay are the most planted grape varietals, and together they make up 44% of the total vineyard plantings. Did you know that the Australian Wine Research Institute, or AWRI, is one of the most prestigious and admired wine academies in the world? Today, Australian winemakers and vine growers are embracing change and are experimenting with new grape varietals, the most notable one being Pinot Grigio, which comprised 2.4% of the national harvest in 2010. Viognier is another grape varietal that has grown in popularity, along with Tempranillo, Sangiovese, Zinfandel, and Barbera. For new plant material to be approved in Australia is a painstakingly slow process, as their quarantine system is very strict. This is in an effort to avoid bringing diseased plant material into the country. Although there is much variety in the Australian wine landscape, Shiraz remains the iconic Australian grape. Australian Shiraz built its reputation and is recognized as being ultra-concentrated, full-bodied, and heavily oaked. Often these grapes are picked very ripe and co-fermented with Viognier. Today there's a new way of thinking, and winemakers are moving away from this style and exploring a more elegant and lighter approach. Some of them even labeling their wines as Syrah, in a reference to the Rhone style, instead of Shiraz, which is typically Australian. Change has not only been witnessed in the style of Shiraz, but Chardonnay has also been approached with completely new lenses. Typical Australian Chardonnay from the 90s could be compared to the bold American styles, rather than the delicate Burgundian style. These Chardonnays were full-bodied, rich, and heavily oaked. As Australian wines gained popularity in the export market, specifically in the UK and USA, they realized that they needed to change their approach and reinvent their style. Today, Australian Chardonnays resemble their Burgundian cousins and are lean, complex, and bright. The start of the Australian wine industry might have been more of a wine factory outlook, with focus on technology and volume. But today, there's a movement for a much more artisanal approach, with a focus on expression of terroir, varietal characteristics, and traits. Next up, let's take a look at some important wine-producing regions in Australia. When it comes to wine regions in Australia, the centre is definitely in South Australia, or SA. This is also where the AWRI is located. This research institute is a global leader when it comes to research on farming techniques, specifically in dry climates, as well as large commercial winemaking operations. Two other very important wine regions we'll be looking at today are New South Wales, or NSW, and Victoria. South Australia and New South Wales are both warmer climates, so you can expect to find grape varietals there that are better suited to warm climates, such as Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon. Victoria, on the other hand, is cooler, and so here you can find grape varietals that are better suited to cooler climates, like Pinot Noir. Western Australia produces a small amount of wine, only about 2% of the total production of the country, but produces really top quality wines, specifically Bordeaux-style red blends from the Margaret River region. South Australia could be compared to California, in other words, the wine capital of the country. South Australia accounts for more than half of the total production of Australian wine. The capital of South Australia is Adelaide, a very famous food and wine hub. The Barossa Valley has a rich history of wine and vines, and the first vineyards that were established here were by German-speaking immigrants from Silesia, which is now Poland. This region is identified as producing some of the top quality wines of Australia. In terms of climate, the days here are hot, but some relief from the heat is experienced at night. Most of the vines are planted along the North Yarra River. The vines are well adapted to the region, as they are deep-rooted bush vines, of which a large portion are over a century old. The average growing temperature during the growing season in the region is 19.8 degrees Celsius, and the region receives a total annual rainfall of 480 millimeters. Unfortunately, one of the challenges that this region faces is that they can be struck by periods of drought. What makes these vines super unique is the fact that in this region in Australia, they have not yet been affected by the devastation caused by the phylloxera louse. So many of these vines are still ungrafted, another reason why their plant quarantine regimes are so stringent. The signature wine of the region is Shiraz, and wine made from these old, ungrafted, unirrigated vines are concentrated, complex, and distinctive. Typically, these wines are bold and rich, with notes of chocolate and spice. Along with Shiraz, other grape varietals that you can find in the Barossa Valley include Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache Noir, Semillon, and Chardonnay. Eden Valley has altitude on its side, with many of its vines planted up to 500 meters above sea level. This region is located to the east of the Barossa Valley and historically is actually an extension of it. The signature grape of the region is Riesling, thanks to the Silesian settlers. Young Rieslings from this region are typically floral and mineral, with citrus notes of grapefruit. As the wine ages, it tends to develop a toasty character. And in terms of an iconic red wine from the region, Shiraz wears the crown. Clare Valley is synonymous with Riesling and is located to the north of the Barossa Valley. Here you will not only find iconic expressions of Riesling, but also Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon. This region is in fact a collection of narrow valleys with varying soil types and unique pockets of mesoclimates. The altitude of the region and the cool evenings help to retain the natural acidity of the grapes. The south of the Clare Valley is considered Riesling country. Vines here are planted on limestone-rich soils, and wines made from these grapes are very perfumed, expressive, and distinctive. In the north of the valley, the soils are slate, and these harder soils make it more difficult and challenging for Riesling vines to grow here. The resultant wines are way more austere. Did you know that winemakers in the Clare Valley were the first winemakers in Australia to use the screw cap closure on their wines in a deliberate effort to retain the purity of the wine? Typical Rieslings from this region are bone dry and intense, especially when they are young. When you compare them to Eden Valley Rieslings, they present notes of lime instead of grapefruit, and they also develop a toasty character with bottle aging. Before we continue on our wine tour of Australia, allow me a moment to let you know what's coming up in the final lesson of Module 4. Next up, we're going to learn about innovation in the wine industry, from berry to bottle and beyond. We'll learn about sustainable practices, innovative technology, and look at where the industry is heading. At the end of Lesson 8, we'll look at the wine industry in a nutshell. We'll take a little moment to recap on what we have learned, cross the T's, and dot the I's. The first wine region in Australia to be associated with super fresh and citrusy Sauvignon Blanc is Adelaide Hills, now the region's most popular grape varietal, followed by Chardonnay. This region also produces top quality Riesling, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Noir, and Shiraz. This region houses the Mount Lofty range and is considered cool climate. In fact, frost during springtime is a risk here, and cooler temperatures mean that vines can sometimes struggle with proper fruit set. This region receives ample rainfall in the winter months, on average around 700 millimeters a year. The average temperature during the growing season is 17.3 degrees Celsius, so a whole 2.5 degrees Celsius cooler than the Barossa Valley, which may seem small, but in viticulture is quite significant. This area produces great cool climate Chardonnay and sparkling wine. Shiraz plantings are steadily growing, and Pinot Noir is the most popular red grape varietal. This cool climate region also makes beautiful aromatic white grape varieties such as Viognier, Pinot Grigio, and of course, Riesling. Did you know that the Great Barrier Reef is one of the largest ecosystems in the world? It consists of over 2,000 individual reefs and is actually visible from outer space. Coonawarra is a region that is known for and actually defined by its distinctively red soils known as terra rossa. The climate here is quite Mediterranean, with the average temperature during the growing season being a cool 16.6 degrees Celsius. The average annual rainfall of the region is a total of 576 millimeters, and the main grape varietals that you'll find here include Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Shiraz. Beneath these red, crumbly soils, you'll find a layer of limestone. These soils are really well drained and have a permanent water table, which makes them pretty perfect for growing grapevines. Originally, Coonawarra was known for Shiraz. In the late 1960s, it was noticed that the region is quite ideal for Cabernet Sauvignon, and vineyard plantings of this grape varietal steadily increased. The attributes that make this region suitable for quality Cabernet Sauvignon is the fact that the region is quite southerly located, meaning it is cooler than most wine regions in South Australia. Coonawarra is also located close to the coastline, so it benefits from cool sea breezes during the growing season. On the downside, this cooler climate means that there is quite a high risk for frost during the springtime, and in cooler years, the region can struggle to ripen their crop properly. New South Wales has got 16 official wine regions, and even though it is one of the smaller wine regions, it certainly is one of the most important. New South Wales is where Australian wine began, and up until the 1970s, this region produced a total of 1/3 of all of Australia's wine. Today, South Australia has overtaken New South Wales production-wise and is seen as the centre of wine in Australia. There are various mesoclimates that exist along 8 wine regions, including big rivers, south, central, and northern rivers, and most famously, the Hunter Valley. Let's take a closer look. For many people, Australian wine is synonymous with the Hunter Valley. Semillon has become the distinctive wine of the region, and its character is unique and distinctive. These wines are known for their ability to age, some still shining after 15 years. On top of this, the Hunter Valley is the home of iconic Australian Chardonnay. In fact, the first Chardonnay ever made in Australia came from this region and was made by the Cetral Winery in 1968. This region is only a short 2-hour drive from Sydney, and geographically is situated at the base of the Broken Back Range, which forms part of the Great Dividing Range. Most of the vineyards are planted along rolling hills. The climate here is subtropical to Mediterranean, with most of the rainfall concentrated in the summer months, so viticulturists need to keep an eye out for fungal diseases in the vineyards. The main grape varietals that are grown here include Semillon, Chardonnay, and Shiraz. Of all of the wine regions in Australia, Victoria is one of the most varied in terms of terroir. At the end of the 19th century, Victoria had as much area under vine as South Australia and New South Wales combined. Similarly to how a wine industry was established in California, Victoria was established thanks to the gold rush in the mid-19th century. Sadly, by the 1870s, phylloxera wreaked havoc and destroyed many of the vineyards. Victoria has got 19 official wine regions and boasts an incredibly diverse climate and thereby diverse wines, from richly sweet dessert wines from the Muscat grape varietals to iconic Shiraz to crisp, sparkling wines from Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Subregions in Victoria include Northeast Victoria, Central Victoria, Western Victoria, Port Phillip and Gippsland, and climates vary from arid and dry to cool, high-altitude sites. Two very popular wine regions in Victoria include the Yarra Valley and the Mornington Peninsula, which are both praised for their Pinot Noirs. In fact, the Mornington Peninsula hosts an international Pinot Noir festival every second year. Western Australia may be the biggest state in Australia, currently only produces between 2 to 5% of the nation's wine. The region extends a total of 1,600 kilometers from east to west. Majority of the wine regions are situated along the cooler southwest area, along the coast, thanks to the influence of the Antarctic and Indian Ocean. As one ventures towards the northwest, the climate becomes too warm to cultivate grapevines. In fact, did you know that the northeastern corner of Western Australia is the warmest area of the entire continent? The climate here is similar to that of Bordeaux, which greatly explains why grape varietals such as Cabernet Sauvignon thrive there. Other important grape varietals that can be grown in Western Australia include Shiraz, Merlot, Chardonnay, Semillon, and Sauvignon Blanc. The region of Western Australia as a whole has got quite a variation of soils and mesoclimates. Along the coast, the soils are sandy with scattered pockets of well-drained gravel, and in general are less fertile, great for grapevine cultivation. As one moves inland, the soils change to a darker, more mineral-rich, fertile soil. Due to the cooler climate of Western Australia, the style of wines from the area are quite unique and more resemble European styles than typical Australian styles. A blend of Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon is typical to Western Australia, and the profile is characteristically grassy and green. There are a total of 9 wine regions in Western Australia, and some of the most notable being Margaret River, the Swan Valley, Perth Hills, the Great Southern, and the Southern Forest. Today we'll only highlight one region, the famous Margaret River. Now, Margaret River is currently the largest wine region in Western Australia, occupying about a third of the total production of wine. Grapevine growing and winemaking started here in the 1960s, and today it's known as one of the most beautiful wine regions in Australia. The harvest season starts in February and carries on well into the month of April. The soils here are mainly gravelly loam soils that are deep and very well drained. The rainfall is concentrated in the winter months, and the average temperature during the vine growing months is a cool 21 degrees Celsius. The wines from this region are quite elegant in style and quite European, thanks to the maritime influence. The most iconic wine from the region is arguably Semillon, which is also associated with the famous Hunter Valley. In fact, Semillon is the most planted grape varietal in the Margaret River, followed by Cabernet Sauvignon and then Sauvignon Blanc. Chardonnay is also very popular in this region. If I could summarize New Zealand wines in a nutshell, I'd say they are wines that have crystalline fruit purity and a racy, bright acidity, both in their red and their white wines. These traits are what make New Zealand quite unique among the New World wine producers, as they manage to display varietal fruit character that is typical of the New World, but retain natural acidity like the wines from the Old World. The hallmark wine of New Zealand has got to be Sauvignon Blanc. New Zealand only produces 1% of the world's wine and is known as the Sauvignon Blanc capital of the world. The first vines were planted here in 1970, and New Zealand is still quite a new member in the world of wine. Up to 2/3 of the total wine produced in New Zealand is exported. Most winemakers make wine in bigger wineries, a setup known as a custom crush or contract winemaking. This means that many winemakers don't actually own their own wine cellars, but rather rent cellar space and facilities at a larger winery. The soils in New Zealand are highly fertile and nutrient-rich. These traits of the soils, along with the high annual rainfall, means that vines grow very vigorously, in fact, too vigorously. As a result of this, careful consideration with regards to vigor control were needed in terms of trellising systems, clonal selections, and canopy management. All in all, New Zealand is considered as a cool climate wine-producing region, thanks to the cool westerly sea breezes from the Pacific Ocean and the influence that the mountains have on cloud formation and rainfall patterns. New Zealand consists of 2 islands, namely the North Island and the South Island, and wine is produced on both islands. Let's take a deeper dive into the wines from New Zealand. Did you know that New Zealand was the first country to give women the right to vote in 1893? Now, Sauvignon Blanc thrives in cool climates with loads of sunlight. The northern region of the South Island of New Zealand pretty much has the perfect terroir for zingy Sauvignon Blanc. The terroir here is so unique, and the wines that come from this area are so distinctive. It seems that this style cannot be replicated in any other wine region in the world. Can you guess how much of the total production of wine in New Zealand is Sauvignon Blanc? Quite a lot. In fact, in 2011, it made up 70% of the total harvest. Now, when you think of New Zealand wines, I want you to keep 2 words in mind, and they are zest and zing. This is the signature attribute of white wines coming from here. Chardonnay also bears this trademark, so it's not only limited to Sauvignon Blanc. In terms of red wine, Pinot Noir enjoys the same elements of terroir as Sauvignon Blanc, namely the cool climate and ample sunshine. Other grape varieties found here include Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Syrah. And growing in popularity are your aromatic white grape varietals, such as your Riesling, Pinot Gris, and Gewürztraminer. Let's highlight a few important wine regions in New Zealand. Regions to focus on the North Island for Sauvignon Blanc include Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, and Gisborne. The climate here is slightly warmer when compared to the South Island, especially as one moves inland away from the coastline. As a result, you can expect the profile of Sauvignon Blanc to be riper, displaying notes of fruit like nectarine and other stone fruits. Other grape varietals that can be found on the North Island include some impressive Syrahs, some Bordeaux red varietals, so your Cabernets, Merlot and Malbec, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Gris, and Gewürztraminer. The South Island of New Zealand has a longer and cooler growing season when compared to the North Island, meaning that the Sauvignon Blanc wines from here are fresher and greener. Typically, Sauvignon Blanc from the South Island is described as crisp, fresh, aromatic, and zingy. Important wine regions for Sauvignon Blanc on the South Island include Marlborough, which is the most famous wine growing region in New Zealand, Nelson, Canterbury, and Cetral Otago. Sauvignon Blanc isn't the only grape varietal that's grown here. You can also find rich Chardonnays, iconic Pinot Noirs, and expressive aromatic white varieties like Riesling and Pinot Gris. Today, we'll study the profiles of two wines, namely an Australian Semillon and New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. The first Semillon vines were planted in Australia in the 1830s, and today, the total area of Semillon vineyards is about 4,500 hectares, which equals around 11,000 football fields. You can find various styles of Semillon across Australia, from easy drinking fresh styles to full-bodied and rich and even sweet dessert wines. The most famous regions in Australia that produce Semillon are the Hunter Valley and Margaret River. Typically, the Semillon grapes from the Hunter Valley are harvested early, fermented, and then bottled with very short maturation times. These wines have a lower alcohol, only around 12%, and sometimes even less. The typical flavor and aroma profiles of these wines include notes of freshly cut grass, loads of citrus, and a fresh, zingy acidity when they're young. With age, they evolve and intensify in body and mouthfeel, and those youthful notes of citrus and green grass evolve into honey and nuts, resembling the profile of a lusciously oaked Chardonnay, even though most of these Semillon wines are unoaked. One of the signature wines of the Margaret River is a blend of Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc, which we know as the classic white blend of Bordeaux in France. We learned in our lesson in France that these two grape varietals are such a complementary pair, working together in flavor, texture, and aroma to create a blend that is greater than the sum of its parts. Typically, in the Margaret River, both of these components are fermented in stainless steel and do not see oak, resulting in a wine that is crisp and fresh with a racy acidity. Some winemakers do like to tweak their blends a bit and experiment with separate components. They might decide to ferment some portions in oak and others in stainless steel, for example. This is where the winemaker can use winemaking and maturation techniques to enhance the personality of the grape varietal and add to the complexity of the blends. Remember, all the summary notes and slides for this course are available in your course materials, and these will be really worthwhile to keep as a resource at your fingertips during this course and afterwards. These resources will also really help you in preparation, not only for your weekly assignments, but for your module assignment. The next wine profile we'll dive into is Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. The three regions for Sauvignon Blanc on the North Island include Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, and Gisborne. Now, Hawke's Bay is the oldest wine region in New Zealand, and Sauvignon Blanc wines from this region lend themselves to a more tropical profile thanks to the warmer climate. Sauvignon Blanc from the Wairarapa region is often described as being herbaceous and slightly green. Think about your green bell pepper. They're also defined by stone fruit and distinctive minerality. Gisborne probably delivers the ripest form of Sauvignon Blanc on the North Island. Expect a tropical fruit profile like pineapple, passion fruit, and guava, as well as notes of citrus. Regions in the South Island of New Zealand include Marlborough, Nelson, Canterbury, and Cetral Otago. When it comes to New Zealand's typical style of Sauvignon Blanc, this region produces the benchmark. The trademark style is described as having pungent aromatics of passion fruit and gooseberries, along with notes of freshly cut grass. Nelson is located right next to Marlborough, and the style of Sauvignon Blanc from here are typically less pungent, yet packed with tropical fruit flavors and aromas. Canterbury is located to the south of Marlborough, and Sauvignon Blanc from this region leans more towards the citrus fruit realm rather than the tropical fruit realm. These wines are characteristically more acidic or zesty, with really strong mineral notes. Sauvignon Blanc from Cetral Otago are described as having a flavor and aroma profile of tropical fruits, including your passion fruit, pineapple, and gooseberries. These wines are bone dry and also present strong mineral notes. And in fact, this region is the southernmost wine producing region in the world. For this week's lesson challenge, I'd like you to create a comparative tasting of Old World wine versus New World wine. Choose any blend or grape varietal and take yourself on a taste journey. Write a report outlining the flavor profiles of the wines that you taste. That's a wrap for our world tour. I hope you've enjoyed your journey across the globe, exploring the wonders of vines and wines. It has been such a pleasure going on this adventure with you all. Only one more lesson left before you receive your professional diploma in wine appreciation. Well done. I'm so proud of your dedication and commitment. Thanks again for joining me today, and I'll see you soon for the season finale, Lesson 8.